A week before everything in my life was supposed to become permanent, I woke up with a strange weight in my chest, the kind you can't explain with logic or reason. It was still dark outside, the city quiet, and yet my heart was racing as if something terrible had already happened. At that time I didn't know that this uneasiness was not anxiety, it was instinct. My name is Mary Adams. I was 30 years old, financially independent, emotionally exhausted, and just 21 days away from my wedding. From the outside, my life looked perfect. A stable job as an accountant, my own apartment inherited from my parents, a respectful fiancé, and a future everyone around me admired. But that morning, standing barefoot in my kitchen holding a cup of coffee I never drank, I felt something crack inside me. It wasn't fear. It was awareness. Robert Miller, the man I was about to marry, had entered my life quietly, efficiently, like a solution rather than a question. We met at a bank, talked business first, then life, then dreams. He was confident, calm, protective in a way that made me feel chosen. He didn't play games, didn't disappear for days, didn't make me chase him. When he proposed just 3 months later, in a candlelit restaurant with strangers applauding, I said yes without hesitation. That yes haunted me now. Not because I didn't love him, but because I hadn't asked myself why. That same morning, after barely sleeping, I received a message from Robert. My mom wants to see us today. She's excited about the wedding details. His mother, Teresa Miller, had always unsettled me. Polite but sharp, smiling but observant, she asked questions that felt less like curiosity and more like evaluation. About my income, my property, my independence. Still, I agreed to go. It was the reasonable thing to do. Except something inside me screamed not to. That night, I dreamed of my grandmother Clara. My second mother, the woman who raised me while my parents worked endlessly before their tragic accident. She had passed away 4 years earlier, yet in my dream she looked as real as the last day I saw her. She stood in her old living room, wearing the same blue robe, her eyes intense, urgent. "Cancel your wedding immediately," she said. "He is not who he claims to be. Go to his mother's house alone tomorrow morning. You will understand everything." I tried to speak, to ask questions, but my body wouldn't move. Before I woke up, she whispered, "This is not love. It's a trap." I woke up shaking, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding at 4:46 a.m. The room was silent, but the warning echoed louder than any noise. Most people would dismiss a dream. I didn't. My grandmother had always taught me one thing. Never ignore what your soul is trying to tell you. And that was the moment my life quietly changed direction. Before I even realized I was standing at the edge of something dark, something carefully hidden behind smiles, promises, and a wedding dress already hanging in my closet. I didn't say anything right away. That's the thing people don't understand about moments like these. You don't always explode, you don't always cry or shout or demand answers. Sometimes you go quiet. Too quiet. After I said those words, "Cancel your wedding immediately," I hung up before she could respond. My hands were steady, which surprised me. My heart wasn't racing. It felt as if something inside me had finally clicked into place, like a lock turning after years of forcing the wrong key. I sat at the small dining table, the one I bought after her father passed, and stared at the faint scratch marks left by years of family dinners, school projects, spilled drinks, and arguments that never fully healed. I remembered when she was little how she used to climb onto that same chair. Her legs too short to touch the floor, swinging back and forth while telling me about her day. I remembered promising myself I would protect her from the world no matter what. Funny how life rearranges those promises without asking permission. The wedding invitation was still on the counter, glossy and elegant, with names printed in a font that screamed confidence and certainty. It looked nothing like the knot forming in my stomach. I picked it up, traced her name with my finger, and felt a wave of sadness, not because of what I'd said, but because I knew exactly why I'd said it. This wasn't about control. It wasn't about disapproval or fear of losing her. It was about something far deeper, something I had ignored for too long because facing it meant admitting I had failed her in ways I never meant to. You see, I hadn't always been this woman who gave shocking ultimatums over the phone. Once I was the mother who made excuses, who smoothed things over, who told herself that love meant patience, even when patience became silence and silence became damage. When she introduced me to her fiancé the first time, I noticed it immediately. The way he spoke over her, the way she laughed too quickly at his jokes, the way her shoulders tensed whenever he entered the room. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself I was projecting my own past, my own regrets. After all, she was grown now. Educated. Independent. She wouldn't choose someone who would hurt her. Right? That's what I told myself while ignoring the small moments that didn't sit right. The jokes at her expense, the subtle corrections, the way he decided things for her instead of with her. Every time my instincts whispered, I pushed them down. I didn't want to be that mother. The dramatic one. The interfering one. So I smiled. I nodded. I stayed quiet. But quiet has a cost. It accumulates interest and eventually the debt comes due. The call that morning wasn't planned. I hadn't woken up intending to shatter her world with 5 words. I was making tea, staring out the window when my phone buzzed. Her name lit up the screen and for a brief moment I felt relief. Maybe she was calling to share something joyful. Maybe she just wanted to hear my voice. Instead, her tone was rushed, distracted. She talked about the seating chart, the guest list, the pressure from his family. She laughed when she mentioned how he didn't want me involved too much because, as she said, he thinks you worry too much. That's when it happened. Something inside me broke. Not loudly, not violently, but completely. I saw the pattern in an instant, clearer than I ever had before. The minimizing. The distancing. The subtle rewriting of reality. I heard my younger self in her voice, making herself smaller to keep the peace. And suddenly I wasn't thinking about the wedding at all. I was thinking about 10 years from now. 20. A lifetime of swallowed words in shrinking spaces. That's when I said it. Not as a suggestion. Not as a plea. As a warning. Cancel your wedding immediately. I didn't explain. I didn't soften it. Because deep down, I knew explanations would give her room to argue, to defend, to rationalize what didn't deserve rationalization. When I hung up, the silence in the room felt heavy but honest. No pretending. No polite lies. Just truth sitting between me and the ticking clock on the wall. A few minutes later my phone buzzed again. Then again. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't care, but because I needed her to sit with the words the same way I had sat with my fears for years. As the day went on, memories surfaced that I had buried on purpose. Her father's voice, sharp and dismissive. The way I used to tell myself he was just stressed, just tired, just misunderstood. The way I convinced myself that endurance was the same thing as strength. I wondered how many lessons she absorbed without me realizing it. How many times she watched me accept less and learned that love meant tolerating discomfort. The thought made my chest ache. Maybe this moment, this painful, dramatic moment, wasn't about stopping a wedding. Maybe it was about breaking a cycle. By evening, I finally checked my messages. There were dozens. Confusion. Anger. Hurt. One voice message stood out. Her voice was shaking. Not angry. Not defensive. Just scared. She said, "Mom, what are you talking about?" I sat back, closed my eyes, and realized this was only the beginning. Because once you speak a truth out loud, you can't take it back. And I wasn't going to. I waited until the next morning before calling her back. Not out of cruelty, but because some conversations need space to breathe before they can survive the weight of truth. When she answered, her voice was quieter than I expected, stripped of the sharp edges from the night before. There was exhaustion in it, the kind that comes from lying awake replaying words over and over, trying to bend them into something less frightening. I asked her how she was, and for a long moment she didn't answer. Then she said something that made my throat tighten. "I don't know anymore." That was when I knew I hadn't imagined things, that my instincts hadn't betrayed me. We talked slowly, carefully, like people walking across thin ice. She told me about the arguments she'd stopped mentioning, the way he checked her phone just out of concern. The way decisions slowly stopped being mutual. She laughed nervously as she spoke, minimizing her own pain, and I recognized that sound instantly because it used to come from my own mouth years ago. I didn't interrupt. I didn't say "I told you so." I just listened because sometimes listening is the first real act of protection a parent can offer. When she paused, I told her about her father, not to reopen old wounds, but to finally be honest about the ones I'd hidden. I told her how love can quietly turn into control if you excuse it long enough. How strength isn't staying silent but knowing when to walk away. There was crying then on both sides, not loud or dramatic, just the kind that leaks out when you finally stop holding your breath. She admitted she'd been afraid to call off the wedding because everyone expected it, because deposits were paid, because people would talk. I told her something I wish someone had told me decades earlier. It's better to disappoint a crowd than to lose yourself for a lifetime. The call ended without a clear decision, but something had shifted. I could feel it. The certainty she once spoke with was gone, replaced by questions, and questions, I've learned, are often the first step toward freedom. The days that followed were heavy with silence, the kind that presses against your chest and makes even ordinary moments feel charged with meaning. I replayed our conversation again and again while going about my routine, watering the plants, folding laundry, standing at the sink longer than necessary just to watch the water run, wondering if I had said too much or not enough. Every mother fears that line, the invisible one between protecting and interfering, and I had crossed it knowingly, fully prepared to carry whatever consequences followed. She didn't call for 2 days, and those 48 hours felt longer than years. When she finally did, it wasn't with answers, but with cracks in the story she'd been telling herself. She said she'd started noticing things she'd trained herself to ignore. How he corrected her in front of others with a smile that never reached his eyes. How her opinions were always met with "you're overthinking." How her excitement about the wedding had slowly turned into anxiety she blamed on stress. She told me she had tried to bring up her doubts to him the night before, gently at first, then with growing urgency, and his response hadn't been reassurance, it had been anger. Not shouting, she clarified quickly, as if to defend him even now, but a cold irritation that made her feel small, foolish for even questioning him. He reminded her of how much money had been spent, how embarrassing it would be to cancel, how people would judge her. That word lingered between us when she said it, heavy with realization. Not us, her. I could hear the shift happening in real time. The way understanding settles, not with fireworks but with a quiet, sinking clarity. I told her something else then, something I hadn't planned to say but felt necessary. That love should make your world bigger, not smaller. And if you already feel like you're shrinking before the vows are spoken, marriage won't reverse that. She asked me what I would do if I were her age again, knowing what I know now. The question broke my heart and healed something in me at the same time. I told her the truth, that I would choose fear for a moment over regret for a lifetime. That I would trust the voice inside that whispers warnings long before it ever screams. When we hung up, there was still no final decision. But there was something new in her tone. A steadiness. A sense that she was no longer just reacting, but beginning to reclaim herself. And for the first time since that terrible phone call, I allowed myself to believe that whatever happened next, she wouldn't walk into it blindly. That week unfolded slowly, like the careful turning of pages in a book you're afraid to finish, because you already sense how much it will change you. She didn't rush into any dramatic announcements or confrontations, and I was grateful for that. Instead, she began asking questions, quiet, thoughtful ones she had never dared to ask before. She told me she started paying attention to the way he reacted when plans didn't go his way, how quickly patience turned into irritation, how often compromise meant her bending while he remained rigid. One evening, she admitted she had tested something small, nothing that would cause a scene. She suggested postponing the wedding date by a few months, framing it as practical rather than emotional. His response, she said, had chilled her. He didn't ask why. He didn't want to know what she was feeling. He immediately talked about deposits, reputation, how his family would react, and how much inconvenience it would cause him. She realized then that the wedding wasn't about building a life together for him. It was about winning, about control, about presenting an image to the world. As she spoke, her voice trembled. Not with hysteria but with the grief of seeing someone clearly for the first time and mourning the version of them you hoped was real. I listened without interrupting, knowing that this part of the journey couldn't be guided or rushed. She needed to arrive at her own truth. She told me she had started confiding in a close friend, someone she trusted completely, and that friend had reacted not with surprise but with concern she'd been holding back for months. That realization hurt almost as much as everything else. The knowledge that others had seen the warning signs while she'd been too in love, too invested, too afraid to admit what they might mean. One night, she said, she stood in front of the mirror and barely recognized herself. The joy she once felt when she imagined her future had been replaced by a constant knot in her stomach, a feeling she'd normalized because she thought commitment required sacrifice. I reminded her gently that sacrifice and self-erasure are not the same thing, and that love doesn't demand you silence your instincts. When she finally asked me, in a small, fragile voice, whether I would support her no matter what she decided, I didn't hesitate for a second. I told her yes, without conditions, without expectations, that I would stand by her whether she walked down the aisle or walked away entirely. I could hear her exhale on the other end of the line, a long breath she'd been holding for far too long. And in that moment I understood that my role wasn't to decide for her or even to protect her from pain. It was simply to remind her that she was allowed to choose herself, even if that choice came at a cost. The decision didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, settling into her thoughts during the most ordinary moments, while washing dishes, while driving to work, while lying awake beside someone who no longer felt safe to be vulnerable with. She told me that once the truth took root, it became impossible to ignore. Every conversation with him began to feel rehearsed, every affectionate gesture hollow, as if she were playing a role in a story she no longer believed in. She tried, she really did, to give him one last chance, not by accusing or threatening, but by opening her heart completely. One evening, she sat him down and spoke carefully, explaining her fears, her doubts, the heaviness she'd been carrying for months. She told him she needed reassurance, partnership, a sense that they were equals walking into marriage together. He listened, arms crossed, expression tight, and when she finished, there was a long silence that felt heavier than shouting ever could. Then he told her she was overthinking, that stress made women emotional, that once the wedding was over everything would fall into place. That was the moment she knew. Not because of anger or cruelty, but because of dismissal. He didn't see her pain as real, only as an obstacle to be managed. She said something inside her went still, like a door quietly closing. Over the next few days she began preparing, not dramatically, not with tears and chaos, but with a calm resolve that surprised even her. She gathered her important documents, spoke discreetly with the venue about cancellation policies, and leaned heavily on the friend who had been urging her to trust her instincts. Each step felt terrifying, but also strangely grounding, as if she were slowly reclaiming pieces of herself she'd handed over without realizing it. When she finally told him she needed to call off the wedding, not postpone it but cancel it entirely, he didn't ask if she was okay. He asked how she could do this to him. He talked about embarrassment, money, what people would say. She listened, heart pounding, and for the first time she didn't rush to soothe him or explain herself away. She simply said she couldn't marry someone who refused to hear her. His reaction confirmed everything she feared: anger, blame, disbelief that she could make such a decision without his approval. When she told me about it afterward, her voice shook, but beneath the fear was something new: strength. She said walking away felt like stepping into cold water. Shocking, painful, but undeniably real. The future was suddenly uncertain, but it was hers again. And as I listened, I knew that even though the hardest part still lay ahead, she had crossed the most important line of all. The one where she chose truth over comfort, and self-respect over a life built on quiet misery. The days after the cancellation felt unreal to her, like walking through a familiar neighborhood after a storm and realizing how much had changed even though the streets looked the same. At first, there was shock. Messages from relatives, confused calls from friends, the inevitable whispers that reached her through second-hand conversations. Some people asked gently if she was okay, but others were less kind, hinting that she had overreacted or thrown away something good enough. She admitted those comments hurt more than she expected, especially from people who had no idea what her private doubts had cost her emotionally. Yet every time the guilt tried to take hold, she reminded herself of that conversation, the crossed arms, the way her fear had been brushed aside as irrational. That memory became her anchor. She told me that grief and relief arrived together, tangled so tightly she couldn't separate them. She mourned the future she had imagined, the shared holidays, the children she thought they'd have, the version of herself she believed marriage would complete. At the same time, there was a quiet sense of breathing space, as if a constant pressure had finally lifted from her chest. Slowly, she began rebuilding her days with intention. She returned the dress, a moment that nearly broke her, but also felt symbolic, like laying down a weight she'd been carrying for too long. She reconnected with friends she had unintentionally neglected, people who listened without judgment and reminded her who she was before everything became about compromise. One evening, sitting alone with a cup of tea, she realized she hadn't checked her phone in hours, not out of fear or avoidance, but because she simply didn't need to. That realization brought tears, not of sadness but of relief. He tried to reach out, alternating between apologies and accusations, but she held her ground. She told me it was the hardest thing she'd ever done, choosing not to respond when every instinct told her to smooth things over. Yet with each day of silence, her confidence grew. She started making plans that had nothing to do with anyone else's expectations. Small things at first, like booking a weekend away, then bigger ones like considering a career move she had once dismissed as impractical. The future no longer felt like a script she was obligated to follow. It felt open, uncertain, but honest. She said the most surprising part wasn't the pain or the loneliness, it was the pride. Not the loud, celebratory kind, but a steady, internal knowing that she had protected herself when it mattered most. By the time the noise of the canceled wedding faded into the background, she understood something deeply. Walking away hadn't been an act of fear, as some people suggested. It had been an act of courage. And while she didn't know exactly what came next, she knew one thing for certain. Whatever future she built now would be one where her voice mattered, starting with herself. Months later, when she looked back on everything that had happened, the story no longer felt like a moment of crisis but like a turning point she had desperately needed. Life didn't magically become easy after she canceled the wedding. She was honest about that. There were quiet nights when loneliness crept in, mornings when she questioned whether starting over had been the right choice, and moments when seeing couples together stirred a dull ache inside her. But alongside those moments was something she had never truly experienced before. Peace that didn't require her to shrink herself. She began to notice how different her body felt without constant tension, how she slept better, laughed more freely, and spoke without rehearsing her words in her head. The absence of walking on eggshells was its own kind of freedom. Over time, she stopped explaining herself to people who didn't want to understand. She learned that not everyone deserved access to her reasons, her pain, or her healing. Some relationships naturally drifted away, and while that loss stung, it also clarified who truly cared for her well-being. She poured energy into things that made her feel alive again. Work that challenged her, hobbies she had abandoned, friendships that felt mutual instead of draining. One afternoon, she told me, she caught her reflection in a shop window and barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because she looked different, but because she looked lighter, more grounded, like someone who trusted herself. That was when it finally clicked. The wedding hadn't been canceled to destroy a future. It had been canceled to save one. She realized that love should never require constant fear, silence, or self-erasure. If a relationship demanded that price, it wasn't love. It was a negotiation she no longer needed to participate in. By the end of the year, when someone asked her if she regretted her decision, she didn't hesitate. She said no, not even for a second, because even though the path ahead was still unfolding, it was hers. And for the first time in a long while, she wasn't preparing to fit into someone else's life. She was building her own, with clarity, strength, and a deep respect for the woman she had finally chosen to listen to.